Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for our second SOPHIA discussion this week. This is our second group, so we have a different group of students joining us to present. And just so you all know, I have gone ahead and started recording this meeting. And so we will very likely be sharing it afterwards because we've had some requests from people who can't be here but still wanted to see what we're doing. So thank you all for joining us. If you were with us on Monday, we had a really good discussion. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm hoping we can do the same here this afternoon. So again, thank you for joining us for back-to-back sessions. And what I'll do, I'll have the discussion sheet up on the screen, and I'll also share the PDF of it in case you want to download it and have access to it either for tonight or for the future as well. So thank you again, and I'll go ahead and turn things over to the class now.
Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Josh Goggin. I am a student in Dr. Sylvia's Common Law and Ethics course. First off, on behalf of our group, we'd just like to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and just like to lay out a few basic ground rules to help the discussion go as smoothly as possible. So first off, if you could just keep your mics muted if you're not speaking, that would be great. And if you do want to speak and contribute to the conversation, if you could use the raise your hand function, which if you click participants on the bottom of the Zoom, on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see raise your hand. And Dr. Sylvia will be able to call on you and keep the conversation flowing that way. We'd also ask that when you're speaking for the first time, if you could just introduce yourself quickly with your first name. That way we can follow along with the video as well, since we'll be sharing our document over the screen. And lastly, we just ask that everyone be kind, polite, and respectful of other people's opinions within this discussion. So with that being said, thanks again. And I'm going to pass it over to my group member, Shannon, who's going to give an overview of our topic.
Hey. Sorry, was muted. I'm Shannon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So overview is today we are going to be discussing the First Amendment and censorship and what that means. So American individuals' rights to freedom of speech is one of the most important liberties that we possess. This makes the discussion of ethics of censorship even more important. For example, when the Bill of Rights was written, freedom of speech and freedom of the press was limited by the types of media that were available at the time. And with the largest presses producing just a few hundred copies of a newspaper, readership was naturally restricted to those who had the means to access those resources. As technologies advance and audience sizes increase, many have called for increased censorship in order to protect people from what some consider to be offensive, obscene, or inappropriate ideologies and information. A painting, photograph, a piece of music, poetry, book, etc., they may all say or portray the exact same story or message, but the medium of said message is subjected to unique censorship laws. The Supreme Court has ruled about various types of media and its legal protection under the First Amendment, but is censoring one medium and not another ethical? Then I will turn it over to Matt with the question.
Hello, everybody. I'm Matt, and I'll be reading the first discussion question here. What are your views on a social media service removing content that contains controversial ideas? And what is considered controversial, and who do you think determines what is considered controversial?
So I think maybe I can get us started with an example here that might be helpful to talk about that's come up really in the past week. So if we think about what's been happening with COVID-19, some of the conspiracy theories that have arisen have had to do with it being falsely claiming that it's caused by the spread of 5G networks and the towers that are going up. And in light of that, some people, specifically in England, I believe, have kind of attacked some of these towers and burned them down. And so several social media networks have made moves to disallow some of this content from their services. So Twitter has and YouTube has, to more or less degrees. And that's part of maybe the interesting question here, is that they haven't banned claims that 5G is causing COVID-19, but they have banned any kind of messages that allow direct incitement against people or technologies. And so that actually is a mirror of some laws that have been created around speech. Of course, social media are private companies, and so they don't have to follow the law necessarily. They can decide their own kind of speech processes, as long as it doesn't break any other laws. And so I guess thinking of that question, maybe with that example, kind of what kind of messages should be allowed about COVID-19 might give us a place to start there.
JJ, Ian, the green Ian, not Ian Poyant, he's trying to raise his hand and he's having some difficulty doing so.
Hi, I'm Ian, and apparently I'm not familiar with the other side of Zoom because I'm the teacher, so I'm usually on the hosting end, and I can't find the little button. In any case, what I was going to just say was I think a big part of social media, or just what is controversial and who determines it, kind of depends upon the audience. I think you might have a different view if you're talking about like information going out to, say, middle school, elementary school, or younger kids versus parents. And so is it social media's job then to be censoring stuff to the young? I know this is not related to the COVID-19, which is what you kind of brought up, but is it social media's job to be censoring stuff like that are going out to my high school students that are on social media all the time? Or is that more of the parents' job to understand what it is that their kids are looking at?
Hi there, my name's Owen. I'm part of the group here. I'll jump in on this. At least in my opinion, it's kind of both. More on the parent at first, and then it becomes the children or the student's responsibility, depending on what the age group is. Like if we're looking at elementary school kids, it's definitely the parent to at least do their best to monitor what the kids are watching, especially when it comes to TV and television and YouTube. I said TV and television. I just realized that TV, YouTube, movies, all that stuff, video games as well. It's up to the parent, but as they grow up, they at least should understand that some of these things might be a bit controversial when it comes time to read or view these things, such as some books. And example, I remember some examples in high school where I was told some of this content in this book, more looking at Catching the Ride, like might be a little out of the normal for you guys. So just as a heads up, but I was fine with it. It was a good book, and I was ready for it. I suppose it depends on the maturity on some of the kids as well.
Joseph?
Thank you. I'm Joseph, and I'm just a civilian participating in this. I really appreciate these opportunities. It's near and dear to my heart. I think it's interesting. what we're seeing, I think, is these companies are setting their own rules, right? It's a private company. Facebook isn't a government arm, so it's not under the auspices of the government directly. So when they make their own rules, how are we as individuals supposed to deal with that, if you will? So here's a related COVID example. There's a company that makes a product that they refer to as Heal Light, as in healing light. And this bioscience company has been working on this for quite some time, using light inside the body, which of course President Trump was horribly mocked for and vilified on the web recently, on everywhere, when he mentioned something about this. But it turns out there's actually a scientific research project going on with Cedars-Sinai Hospital and this very legitimate bioscience company that have been working on this. But because of its seeming connection to what the president was talking about, within a matter of almost hours, their Twitter account was closed. Their videos and their presentations were dumped from YouTube, from Vimeo. All of this it was like they ceased to exist. But this was a legitimate inquiry, scientific inquiry in terms of what is possible with these things. And then the president mentions something sort of sounds like that, and all of a sudden, whoosh, they disappeared. Their accounts were closed. These videos were deleted. And personally, I feel like, yes, you're a private company, but I don't think you just get to make stuff up as you go along, right? I think it's reasonable to exercise due diligence as a private company. I think we have to. But I think we also have to be aware of individual rights. And right now it seems like that there's no real balance between those two at this point. That's just kind of the way I see it at this point in my part. Thank you.
I'm glad you brought up that example kind of in light of the COVID-19 discussion, because I think that brings out the second part of this question as well, right? So like, while in some ways it's maybe easier to see why we would want to prevent kind of the controversial, well, I may be complicating my own language there, some of like acts of violence and things like that, what even comes to be considered as controversial is part of what you're raising there, right? And so that's part of the difficulty with this, is that if we do think there are any kinds of speeches that should be moderated, even in the far end of the spectrum, how do we decide where to draw that line, or where social media companies should be able to draw that line?
Well, I was going to ask the question of Joseph. Now, was the stopping of all of the social media aspects of that company, was that the company that stopped those media posts and things like that, or was it other social media like Facebook and Twitter that removed those accounts and deactivated all of that?
Oh, no, this was no way voluntary. They found, so these things had been up there for the longest time, right? I mean, this was something that they'd been doing actual research in. And now all of a sudden they found that if somebody went looking for them, there was nothing there. I mean, this was gone. And Twitter closed their account. YouTube and Vimeo took their videos down. There was nothing voluntary about this reaction. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and one more note. It's something that the doctor you just mentioned when you were talking about violence. Who decides? It reminded me, and I just went and I just checked right now while I was listening. The Punch a Nazi video, which is clearly a display of violence, right? And I'm sure there's a good chance most of the people in this room are aware of this. Quick note if you're not. There was an Antifa demonstration, and somebody punched a Nazi while he was being interviewed on the news. And this video went wildly viral. And I just looked, it's still the top of the search. If you look up Punch a Nazi, this is what you get. So is that an inducement to violence? So I'm just kind of throwing that out there from a little bit of devil's advocate perspective, if you will.
Well, that comes up, I think, relates very well to question number 2 is, what do you consider graphic? Is that something that would really incite someone to violence, or is that just someone making some sort of political statement? And where is the line on that, and where should that line be drawn into what type of speech is restricted? I mean, I'm not saying physical violence is necessarily like something that we should be promoting, but by displaying that and showing that, is that something that should be removed in all cases? And if so, then why should we be able to present films that have violence in them, or show news stories regarding wars and things like that? Why should any of that be allowed to be seen when punching someone with counter viewpoints is not?
I think maybe an important kind of legal element to bring back into this is kind of one of the largest protections that many of these private companies have in terms of this. And if those of you in my class remember, we talked about the Communications Decency Act and Section 230. We talked about that a pretty good bit. Does somebody want to speak to that and kind of what we said that allowed for private companies? Yes, perfect. I don't know if everybody saw, Joseph held up the book, The 26 Words That Created the Internet. And so that book is particularly about that Section 230 in the Communications Decency Act. So again, I know I'm putting you on the spot, and it's been a little while because we talked about this when we were in person before spring break, but does anybody have some memories of that? Because I think that would be a good place to bring this up. Okay, well, I'll say a little bit about it to remind us. But the idea there was that this act, and I believe it was 1996 was when it was created to protect really ISPs at that time, because there weren't really many social media services, but it did include anything where people could post comments. So if you were hosting a web page or posting comments, it gave kind of it allowed the media companies to not be prosecuted for things that users said on it. So for example, right, if I posted something illegal on Facebook, I would be the one legally responsible for it, not Facebook itself. And that was the core idea with that. At least part of the reasoning behind it was that it would be kind of infeasible for these companies to manage all of the various comments that might show up on them, right? So in 1996, if Facebook had existed in some form, they wouldn't have been able to monitor every single piece of content everyone posted. So why I'm bringing this up here kind of in the context of the conversation we're having is that social media companies are beginning to find ways to monitor this content. And it's happening in various ways. Some of them are only if things are reported by other users. Some of them, like YouTube, are using AI to help identify content. But that raises the interesting question in terms of Section 230 here, is that if sites are now able to monitor content in that way, should that ethically and or legally open them back up to being culpable for what's said on them? Because if they are able to make these decisions, is leaving it up a form of supporting it or agreeing with it?
Just to jump in here, so I remember from one of our chapter readings that sort of about that, how there is the idea, and you did say it, but just sort of the clarification, it's kind of for me personally, but the fact that if they are like monitoring that stuff, when the line of the posting the content being liable versus them being liable, sort of the central issue there.
Mm-hmm. And let me invite everyone here to feel free to join in. I mean, this is discussion for everyone. So, again, if you want to jump in and share your thoughts, please don't be afraid. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or if you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please do feel welcome to join us. All right, Mary, I'm going to unmute you.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things I'm thinking about just listening to everybody and just the question itself is this idea of harm. Who are you potentially harming more by allowing graphic content to be posted, as opposed to restricting free speech, and where is that line? And I think that it's probably different for everybody. I mean, I think there's probably some graphic content most people would agree is just too graphic. And then other content, most people would say, it's okay. It's not great, but we can live with it. But I guess that's, I think it's a tough call. How do you find that balance between not harming your users, but also not harming the person that may be posting or maybe expressing their opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think that's part of what is tough at the core of this question is who gets to decide that. And so in some ways, just because of the way these sites have been created, at least in this moment, and it may not stay this way or always be this way, but kind of these corporations or people that own the social media sites are the ones making that decision. And so I guess that's part of what, we're trying to think through is are they the best people to be making those decisions or not? Joseph?
I was going to say, and another thing to keep in mind is that I think it's important that you reference the Communications Decency Act, those 26 words, right? It says that the people hosting it are not responsible. You're not the publisher, is what the words actually said. You're not the publisher, right? So here's the question, just thoughtful questions, if you will. We have a situation in 1996, and I know there's a reference here to the Fairness Doctrine of 49 that was repealed in 87. The Fairness Doctrine gets repealed in 87 that says equal time has to be allowed. 96, we passed the Communications Decency Act. None of what we are talking about today exists in that world. Nothing. There's no Google. There's no anybody with 1 million followers, much less 80 million followers, right? I mean, some of you may be aware from your history classes, they used to have whistle stops for politicians. And maybe if it was a big city, you might get a couple thousand people. Today, when a politician, a celebrity, an athlete, somebody puts out their information, somebody tweets something, they might have 65 million followers. So has the technology changed the necessity for how we think of speech, right? I mean, in England, they have a speaker's corner where you can get anybody who'll stand in front of you and listen to you to hear what you have to say. But you're talking a couple hundred people. What does it mean when somebody has a platform for an almost unlimited number of people, right? What, 2.6 billion people attached to Facebook. So if I put something inappropriate in whatever that word means, or even illegal in whatever that term means, because countries are different, now all of a sudden you have a situation where I have an almost unlimited audience. And that concept simply was not part of the discussion when the rules and the understanding of speech were put into place, right? Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech went out to, wait for it, 120 people. So, and those were, I'm sure they were all his followers, but there were 120 of them.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something that I bring up in the introduction is that the platforms that we have now reach so many people. Is there more responsibility on the people that have these platforms to restrict the amount of speech that they allow? If a newspaper can reach that many followers, is it on the newspaper to edit its content based on however many people that they think is going to be reading it? based on access, because almost everyone has access to these various sites. Does that somehow increase the responsibility for them to very much censor what is being said on those platforms to ensure that there is less harm happening, like trigger warnings and things like that, or just anti-bullying and all of that? Like, how can where do we draw the line of the restriction of freedom of speech and the dissemination of ideas, and what could be considered hateful speech or just one speaking one's mind?
So, I mean, maybe it'd be helpful to turn that question around and think about, like, if you were the one in charge of one of these social media companies right now, where would you draw the line? I mean, because we're asking it very theoretically, but this is really a very practical question. Like, there are people who are having to make these decisions right now. And I mean, I'm curious to hear from at least a few of you, like, where would you draw the line? Would you say there is none? Would you draw it somewhere? If you have to make some decision, because not making a decision is itself a decision, what do you decide?
Well, I'll jump in on this. At least from my opinion, at least where I would draw the line, if I was running it, it would be we'd have to think about how to protect ourselves as well as others in this case. I guess it depends on the content of the violence, so to say. Like, say it's a UFC fight, that's a little that's okay to share, but now we show a street fight, that's a little different. We don't want that, and I would take that down at least, because we don't want such things like that being shown on the internet, at least, because it could come back to hurt us, could come back to hurt the city, and then in some case it could become a legal standpoint for that video, and we don't want that video being aired. I could be completely wrong about how videos like that are handled, but at least in terms of violence, that's kind of like where I would draw the line, at least.
Jay?
Yeah, sorry about that. So I just feel like a lot of this onus has to have a partnership with the people that are putting up content and the people that are consuming it. Because, I mean, even if you put a age restriction on it, so my parents thought I was very mature for this age, so what can I watch appropriately as compared to my cousin whose helicopter mom says she can't watch anything? So, like, if you don't have some type of protections put in place for every part of it, it doesn't make sense to put that ownership on the platform itself, if that makes sense.
Are you saying better built-in kind of guidance as to what the content is, so that parents can make the decision? Am I understanding you correctly on that?
Yeah, so you know how they do, like, the same way they do music and all of that. So I can listen to, as a kid, I was able to listen to a lot more mature stuff than my cousins. So it's got to be a partnership between the producers of the media and the parents or the guardians of the minors, or for any, you have to be an age appropriate.
So, like, if every post you made, you had to kind of submit, and YouTube, I think, is moving towards something like this, where you have to say if it's...
Yeah, I've seen that.
So then, like, as a parent, I could go in and say, well, my child can see anything with a G rating on this post. Is that along the lines of what you're thinking?
Right. They have a separate YouTube for kids, like, and that's okay. If I'm on the adult, I have to be signed on to as myself, so that I have that content available to me if I want to see it. But I don't think it's like one person beating up on another is any different from that guy punching that other one in the face. So whether it's UFC, sports or I enjoy that. But what I'm saying is, I'm old enough to make that choice. I don't think there's a kid that can make that choice.
Yeah, and I see another raised hand, and I'll get right to that. But I think that's interesting. This connects to question 3 as well, if we've seen that one on the screen. But we're also making, I just want to be clear, we are making a distinction here in terms of like what we could put in place in terms of children and parents making those decisions for children, as compared to even what adults might be allowed to see. And so like those are both valid conversations we should be having, but they are in some ways distinct too. And so I want to just make sure we see that distinction between them as well. So Ian, I'm going to unmute you.
So I had 2 things just to address what you were just saying, and then my own thoughts on where that line should be drawn if I was in charge of a media site. As I mentioned prior, I do teach in a city school, and I can tell you that it would be great and ideal if parents were involved with their kids and understood where their kids were at and monitored age-appropriate activities for their kids up through until they believe and the kid is mature enough. And everybody matures differently, so that is a little bit subjective there. Unfortunately, though, that's, especially in the city schools, not exactly how it works all the time. And a lot of my kids have very little influence from their parents, or any little restrictions from their parents on what they can do or where they can go or what they watch or read or anything like that. And so in a perfect world, sure, but practically it's less so, at least for me in my experience. As for my own thoughts about if I was to produce something, if I was running a media site, where would I draw the line? Big thing for me isn't necessarily what the content might be. It's more of distribution of information and false information and incorrect facts that are being portrayed as true, that are being accepted by true from millions of people. Education has always been a big part of me, and as far as like censorship goes, and for students, for parents, adults, whatever, like if you can provide the right level of education with the material. For example, in high school, we show some of the, in my opinion, most graphic images from things like the Holocaust to our high school students. But we don't just throw these pictures at them. We talk about it and we explain it, and the students learn about what was actually going on at that time with some context for those images. If we can do that for anything, if we can provide sources for information or some sort of reasonable consideration for what is being presented, instead of just, it's like everybody may have an opinion, but some opinions are frankly wrong. You know, the whole flat earth thing is like, the earth is not flat. I mean, you're wrong if you think that, I'm sorry. But other things, so hard facts like that for me, I think is a touchy subject, whereas general actual opinions and discussions is much more open for debate.
So when you're saying that about kind of the hard facts, would that push you towards not allowing that kind of content to be pushed? Is that what you're trying to say?
I would push for things that have been proven scientifically or otherwise, historically accurate information, stuff like that, versus just people, anybody, you know, if one of those celebrities that has 8 million followers goes up and says whatever they want and makes something up, a good chunk of those people are probably going to start to believe it. At least that's what it seems like. So, while I don't want to take away their right to say whatever they want, the influence on those people is causing larger problems.
Joseph?
Yeah, and to piggyback off of what Ian was saying, I think he's exactly right. But the problem develops, like how to say. There's a historian who says that at the beginning of the 20th century, we had our considered opinion, and then the considered opinion became popular opinion, and then popular opinion became popularity. But in a sense, we've always had that, right? That's John Lukács, by the way, the 20th century historian. And I just finished watching a wonderful movie. It's a very old movie. I think it's from like 1936 with Paul Muni as Louis Pasteur. And the entire scientific establishment was organized against Pasteur. We had developed technology that allowed us to see germs, right? We could see tiny little things moving around in blood and in the body. But the entire scientific community, if you can believe this, decided that these things simply arose spontaneously. Germs just created themselves. They didn't come from any place. So when Pasteur said they come from someplace and gave us what we now know today as modern germ theory, he was basically pilloried by the scientific establishment of his day. He wasn't a doctor, he was a chemist, right? And they said that, you can imagine, with complete disdain. And they viewed it from the perspective of, we are the experts. He is just this peasant with a theory. He knows nothing about the realities of science. But, you know, as we all know today, it turns out there really are. The thing is germs. Who knew? Well, he did. But modern science at that time, you know, 150 years ago, decided that he was crazy. They'd done the same thing with a guy named Semmelweis, you know, almost 50 years before that, when he said doctors should wash their hands. And they eventually put him in a mental institution because he believed that germs were real. He didn't understand them. It was before we had the ability to see them. But so modern science, whenever modern happens to be, I'm always a little troubled when we rely on the experts, because it has turned out in the past that there have been times when our experts were wrong.
Yeah, I think you're really digging really well into kind of the philosophic conflict struggle over truth in that sense. And I love the examples you brought up. I think maybe the definitive go-to for that type of thinking is Thomas Kuhn's The Structures of Scientific Revolutions. And he uses several examples like that. But the core point of his book there is that every kind of new direction in science, it was in the beginning a very unpopular opinion or take or evaluation of the current science. And in fact, one of the things he finds is that new views only tend to take over when kind of the people who previously held them start dying and aren't there defending their old views anymore, just to put that really bluntly. And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's tough because, like, those of us who, you know, are going to support something like a spherical Earth or climate change, it's when you point to science being the definitive thing, right? There's also, you always have to be open and kind of willing to listen to contradictory evidence that comes up as well. And science changes over time. And so it's like how you hold both of those things at the same time is one of the real difficulties there. And I think not maybe exactly that scientific reason, but that type of sentiment is behind the kind of very strong free speech protections that are encoded into our Bill of Rights, is that, you know, everyone can sometimes be wrong, and sometimes one person is right. And that's not to say it's true in every case, right? I'm not saying that the minority that thinks climate change is not man-made is necessarily right. That's not my argument. But it's that sometimes it's hard to tell in the moment which it is. And so we have historically as a country leaned toward protecting all speech so as not to kind of prevent the speech that might lead to those scientific, philosophic, or otherwise revolutions in our understanding. Science proceeds one funeral at a time. Yes, thank you. So I don't know. I mean, Ian, I don't want to put you on the spot, but does that Does that shift your thinking at all, or no? I'm curious.
Well, I completely agree that scientists are wrong, and as a proper scientist, it's to accept when new evidence has been presented, and that's how we build. And heliocentric, Galileo was under house arrest because he thought the Earth went around the sun, and that ended up being correct. And other people, whatever. But the difference is where the information was coming from. Now, the whole past year, and he had informed, he had evidence to back it up, he had observations that he had made, and thus the scientists at the time chose to ignore the evidence that was presented to them. The difference, what I was trying to get at, is just somebody claiming something without any evidence, without any backup, without any observations that they've made on that particular piece of information, or just simply not necessarily just scientific, but historical or anything like that, just making a claim that has nothing behind it, just simply because they thought it was a good idea, or I don't know where they come up with these things, but
that's really interesting, and I think, but it gets kind of at the heart of this. And my students, you're going to remember back to early on in the class. This is usually our most frustrating day I have in every class, is when we get into these questions of truth. Is that even what gets counted as evidence is part of kind of the philosophical conundrum here. So what is going to count as evidence? Is that really it? So, like, to bring us back to how we started the discussion, I've really been digging into kind of the 5G conspiracy theories for a piece that I'm working on. And there is evidence there, right? There are reasons given. It's not completely without it. Some of them are things like looking at when various new technologies are released and past pandemics, and there are some that coincidentally happen to correlate, right? So like when 3G was released, I think it was SARS, maybe, I might not have them matched correctly, but that kind of pairing. Back to the Spanish flu, and again, this isn't correct exactly because radio wasn't like launched at one specific point like this, but Spanish flu correlated with widespread radio use. And then sonar and radar. Okay, I hadn't seen the sonar bit. That's interesting. And then the other evidence they give is linking to studies that do show that electromagnetic frequencies can cause damage to humans. Now, the problem is, right, why that's not good evidence is that it's certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation, and 5G is not in that wavelength range. But there are reasons given, but we have to decide whether or not that counts as good evidence. I'm going to unmute you again. Oh, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Two things with that. One is a big thing that I push with all my students is that correlation does not imply causation. Mm-hmm. And that just because there may be a connection there doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other, or even if there is a relationship, it may be a third option that's affecting both things simultaneously that is actually the source of all of this. I just completely derailed my train of thought. So that the evidence needs to point not just to the correlation, but also what is the link that connects one to the other. Okay, so maybe 3G or 5G happen to correlate, but is that just because technology has developed in cycles and diseases develop in cycles, and those cycles just happen to be in sync? There is such thing as coincidence as well. So. I'll stop.
No, I mean, I think this is, I'm enjoying this discussion because I think in some ways it kind of gets at the root of the ethical questions here, right? Like, what do we want to protect and why? And these questions of truth really are kind of the core background of these ethical questions. So I'm glad that we're getting into this. Yeah, Joseph.
to piggyback off of Ian, by the way, great points, right? Causation, correlation, to become aware of this. And then we face two problems, I think. One is, are we even asking these questions, or we just say, or does somebody say, as we've heard in other areas, this is settled science? And a friend of mine made a mention of a statement recently that I read that I thought was delightful. He said, settled science isn't science, it's politics. Right? And when you think about it, as a scientist, we must be open to these things. For those that are interested, there's a wonderful piece on logic and thinking by Chris Agaris, a systems thinking guy. And he talks about what he calls the ladder of inference. And the short version is we start by collecting data, and then we use this to create hypotheses and assumptions and lead to actions, that create our beliefs that lead to actions. And it's a perfectly useful process. And then he points out that the problem with human beings is that we don't do it. We jump immediately to our beliefs, and then we go look for data that supports them, instead of really opening ourselves up to the possibility that we could be wrong ourselves. So even though we have these awesome tools, we tend to use them in slightly modified ways, if you will, to find what we're really looking for. And the other thing is, we accept some limitations. Everybody that said, you hear people say, there must be no limitations on speech, but this is absurd. The Supreme Court imposes limitations on speech, right? Years ago, they came up with a decision that said, you can't yell fire in a crowded, you can't falsely yell fire in a theater, right? And possibly creating a panic and people get hurt. But this violated the Sedition Act, that said that you can't do the government prohibited you from saying certain things, right? And we've since gotten rid of the Sedition Act. We now say that unless somebody walks out and says, I think we should shoot somebody, they haven't committed a crime. That you can go out and you can say, I think you should engage in civil disobedience. And my thought here is, imagine the 1960s if they were like the 1920s. Imagine if Martin Luther King was arrested and prosecuted for suggesting civil disobedience in the form of the civil rights protests in the South. We end up in a very different place if we start to apply rules that were meaningful at one time that may no longer have an application or the same application in our current setting.
I want to go back to this causation correlation thing, because I don't want us to kind of leave it too simply at, well, we just ignore correlation, because I don't think that's entirely fair either. I'm thinking about the hand washing example and how that was discovered, and in some ways I think that relates back to noticing a correlation, right? I don't have all the details on it, but it was like, I think I was trying to look up, but there was a doctor's clinic and a midwife's clinic, and there were less deaths at the midwife's clinic, right? And that was a correlation that was noticed. And so it's only in digging into that correlation that there was a causation able to be discovered. So yes, not all correlations are because of a causation, but sometimes they are. And so I sometimes worry that we just simply write off a correlation without wondering if it should be investigated. So, I think it's sometimes more nuanced than we try to make these discussions. And I'm really dwelling on the details here tonight more than I do sometimes, because I think that's important. See, you can use correlation to design experiments to determine causation. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point from our resident scientists in this discussion. And I would say though, right, like what makes this complicated is even the 5G conspiracy theorists would agree with something like that, right? They're saying like, let's dig into this, let's explore it more for the most part. So I mean, what do you do with that, right? Do you prevent them from saying it at all, or that's the question of free speech here? Yeah.
I have sort of a question here, just sort of thinking about something that we discussed in class a while back, of the idea of not being able to, being able to punish speech after the fact, but not before. And I sort of think that's an interesting sort of consideration in all of this, and whether preventing something beforehand or after is a good methodology in this whole issue.
I think that's probably interesting in terms of what algorithms can and can't do for some of these sites, right? So is it you post something to YouTube and then it has now violated policy and it gets deleted, or is it the algorithm kind of never allows it to be posted in the first place? Is that along the lines of what you're thinking, Matt?
Yeah, I would say so.
Well, let me ask, we're kind of nearing our time limit. So for my students, are there any questions that we haven't gotten to that you're really interested in bringing up, or maybe an angle that you want to use to close us out?
I have something that I'm curious about people's opinions on. So, question number 3. So, we kind of touch on it a little bit in how students' reading comprehension varies at levels of maturity and all of that. And one of the things that I'm curious about too is the censorship of books and censoring books after the fact. For example, like Huckleberry Finn, is it ethical to go back and remove certain words from the original because they don't promote the current ethics of the time, or is it more ethical to leave those kinds of things in to promote the accurate historical timeline, and what people think about that? Because I know there's a lot of pushback with banned books and things like that in certain areas of the country, especially where they try to remove the books because it's racially sensitive, or there's graphic content, graphic materials, and things like that in these books that are then being taught at elementary, middle school, high school levels. And where is the line of assigning these books to read and the ethics of censoring them and basically erasing some of the historical accuracy if we remove some of that content? I agree with Joseph. For those of you who can't see the chat, it says, I think it's never okay to distort the past to serve the present. Such actions appear to be motivated by fear. I fear your reality will be harmful to mine. I'm inclined to agree. I don't think personally that censoring books in any way, especially after the fact, is ethical, because then you're negating historical things.
I was gonna say, I think if if a teacher is teaching a very provocative, but like a book that say has content that, let's say, not suitable to a modern audience, I think there should be like a fair warning, like before like reading the book in class and explain, this is maybe how the culture was during that era, or just like there's certain characters that might have beliefs that maybe they're very offensive. Okay, like they will say, racist, homophobic, misogynist things, but I think it should be reminded the class that's a trade character, and though not an endorsement of what the author is agreeing. So I think we have to make these distinctions when we're talking about any, form of art. So, instead of just censoring the art out, we need to be reminded of what's in place and make sure we can read that distinction. And that goes back to how the maturity thing, because if some people are going to be more mature and handle more difficult content with some, maybe some students just can't handle anything that is going to offend their beliefs or be, a little different than what they're used to. It makes them unsettled and a little out of place with the content. So I think that's, at least in my opinion, any teacher or school board, they should leave out the controversial material and just, explain like a fair warning before ever teaching any of this stuff in class.
I think that gets us back into what's counted as controversial, right?
Yeah.
All right. Another question that I kind of want to touch on before we get out of this is going into 24-hour news stations. And a lot of what you see with 24-hour news stations is that they report things so quickly that a lot of times the initial stories that come out are incorrect or inaccurate somehow. And I'm wondering if anyone has any ideas or thoughts about if that is harmful to journalistic integrity or journalistic ethics overall. And because, like, for example, with paper journalism, it takes longer for the news story to be released, but there's a longer period of time for the editing process to vet the sources and all of that. So is the 24-hour news cycle somehow harming the way that we are viewing journalistic ethics? Joseph. Sand.
I think it's a great question, Shannon, because I think it's a huge issue. We're creating. The problem is we've taken something away by giving people all of this. I was having this discussion the other day about processing information. In 20, 30, 40 years ago, you had news twice a day. You had a newspaper in the morning, maybe for a half hour, and then you had an evening newscast of anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes in the evening. Now, yes, that gave you a more limited perspective sometimes, but it gave you something that we've taken away, and that was a time to process it. So you read about something early in the day, and then you went to work, and you came home and you saw something at night, and then you went to bed and you slept, and you had dinner, and you did all of these things. So what we've done, what the 24-hour news cycle into, which was CNN, right? For those of you that don't know, CNN. By the way, everybody told Ted Turner, who started CNN, that he was completely out of his mind. No way he could possibly make money with a 24-hour news station. Just goes to show you, once again, the expert. So there was no possible way he could make money. But now what we've done is we've taken away the ability for people to reflect. Right? So it's news story, news story, news story, news story. From, we get 100 million perspectives, but we don't get time to think about any one of them or how we connect with any of them. So we're constantly in this information barrage, but we don't stop to think about what we're being informed about very much, because there's never an end to the stream of information.
Some really good points. When I was researching this question a little bit, I was trying to find out if more people watched kind of CBS and network half-hour news programs, or if people watch, or if the ratings are higher on the 24-hour news cycle. And what I found was kind of inconclusive, but that ratings overall were higher in those half-hour, hour-long news segments, but that people overall were watching a higher amount of the 24-hour news cycle, so that even though the ratings were lower at any given point during that 24-hour news cycle, they were tuned in for 2 hours or 3 hours as opposed to just the half hour or 60 minutes that people were tuned into a regularly scheduled news program.
Would it also be possible, just to throw in something on that 24 hours to the 90-minute stations, is it possible that more people are more focused on local news rather than world news in that situation? Because yes, 90-minute stations will talk about world news, but that's like a part of their show. 24-hour networks such as CNN, it's usually stuff that's happening majority of the time in the country, but as well as over the world too. So maybe people might be a little bit more drawn to what's happening locally.
I have two kind of thoughts about this. This study is a little bit older, it's probably 10 or 15 years now, and I haven't seen any updated versions of it, but it showed that people who watched television news, any stations, right, were less informed about world affairs than people who got their news from other sources. So I've long thought that's interesting. I'm also really intrigued where people get their news. In another one of my classes, it's a current events class, we actually talked about this briefly, and there's only about 12 students in there, and I polled them. And it was really interesting. I think every single person in the room got their news from a different source, which goes to show kind of how diverse our news media are today as well, right? So some of them were local news, like you were discussing. You had one that was cable news. One was AOL News push alerts on their phone. Someone else was their local news website. Someone else was like major online newspapers. Right, so like there were several more, but I think you get the idea. Is that like where you get your news from also is kind of very diverse. But one of the reasons I'm bringing that up in terms of this question that you've raised, Shannon, is that I think the 24-hour kind of cable news push drives the background of all of these different news sources, right? Because like even something like the Washington Post now is pushing breaking news on their written digital site, right? So that's still in some ways the 24-hour news cycle, even though it's not cable TV that's always on, but there is still that impetus to kind of put out that information as it's breaking. So even no matter where you get your news, that 24-hour cycle is behind it. Joseph wrote, studies have shown that the more tightly you hold to your understanding of events, the less information you may actually have, which kind of reminds me of our scientific revolutions discussion as well. Well, let me ask, does anybody have any final questions or thoughts that they want to share before we wrap up? All right, well, I saw you just.
Yeah. If I may, thank you once again for doing this, and all of you that are part of what brings this opportunity together. I mean, these are real questions that have real meanings to real people. I mean, this isn't, for those of you that are students in this class, this isn't an academic topic. This is life and death for some people, right? Literally in some cases, in terms of maybe, you know, this bioscience company loses a contract because somebody decides, you know, oh no, YouTube and Vimeo took you down. You must be not real scientists. This is every bit of today's conversation has very real world consequences. Whether we're talking about removing a book from some kid's public school or a school library or public library, and he never gets to read Mark Twain because there's something inflammatory about Huck Finn that somebody objected to. I mean, every aspect about our discussion today has serious consequences. So thank you once again for hosting these events.
Well, thank you for coming.
Very much. I appreciate
Thank you.
how you've been able to contribute to the discussion as well. It's very valuable. And I was talking to our dean after she joined us for the last discussion on Monday, and she was reflecting that kind of the intergenerational component of this as well. People of all kinds of different ages have been able to join these discussions, and that those different perspectives are kind of interesting to reflect on as well. How you know, all of us experience things through our own lens of the life we've led, and that can lead to differences as well. And I think that's part of the value here. And I've had some community members in the past say that like these types of discussions, once you're out of university life, these are more rare than they are when you're a student. And so being able to have these discussions can be kind of sometimes, in some cases, I mean, not for everybody, but in some cases, one of a few places where you can have them. And so I think it's valuable also to get a sense for what people who are different than yourself are thinking as well. And I think that in itself is valuable. So I'm really glad that we've gotten kind of participation from a wide variety of people, and hope we can continue to build that going forward. And I'll say this is our last one of this semester. I hope we can do it in person in the fall, but if not, we'll be back online as well, because these have been valuable for those who have been involved. So thank you to my students for putting this together, kind of thinking through those tough questions with me, and corralling them into this great one sheet that you've produced, and to everybody else who's not in the class who's joined us today.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.